Let's go to Wisconsin, Green Bay, Wisconsin, where our friend, Professor Harvey J.K., is standing by, and he is the author of this book that is a great stocking stuffer, The British Marxist Historians. Get this for the leftist in your life. Please welcome Professor Harvey J.K. It's so great to see you again. It really is. I almost want to cry. I'm so happy to see you.
I almost want to laugh, but that's no, seriously. I don't know if people realize what a pleasure it is for you and for you and me to be able to see each other with your new technology. And I don't know if they realize, though they must, if they're bothering to tune
Right.
into this when we post it. It's been 2 months,
Yes.
2 months. And I can tell you, I've heard from many a person, where's David? Is he okay? When's he going to come back? Any chance, that he'll do it on a regular basis when he does come back? And I say he's just resting. He's entitled to a rest. He was exhausted. I mean, not to mention all that extra work you did for the Herschel Walker campaign.
Yes. And I was very depressed. I knew about a month ago that Herschel was going to lose, and it just sunk me into a depression. My listeners know that about 2 months ago, I got a new computer, and the internet would not work on the new computer. And then it was impossible to do interviews with people unless we did it by phone. And after a pretty rough year of, my mother passing away and
Yeah.
getting arrested and, just all the other stuff that
Wait, you got arrested?
I was arrested in Washington.
When? What am I forgetting?
Don't you remember? Well, we'll talk about that later. But anyway,
No, that you can't drop that in here. And
you never heard the story of my getting arrested at the Capitol
no,
with Triumph the Incel Comic Dog?
no,
You didn't hear about that story?
no. When did that happen?
I think it happened in June. We were
Really?
try Google it. It was a traumatic experience.
I've got the real criminal here, and you're telling me to Google it?
I think I've talked enough about it on the show
Okay.
that the listeners.
Okay. So much for how eager and happy you are to see me.
I am glad to see you. Anyway, so I use this as an opportunity to
Yeah.
take some time off, do as little work as possible. The internet so far seems to be working with us. We're about 4 minutes in, and you haven't crashed.
Wait,
So
but tell me, and we're not at this moment live. We're just recording, right?
we're recording, correct,
Okay. And we don't want to gamble on trying
to go live
to go live.
next
But if we
week.
do that, I want to tell everyone with
Right,
tweets.
right. Now, what are you working on? What are you writing on? But everybody should go buy your book, The British Marxist Historians. This is your first
Well,
book that you wrote, correct?
that was the first book. That goes back to I was writing it in 1982, 83. It published in very late 1984. Actually, and came into this country very early 85. And it was a book that in many ways was out of the ordinary for me. I won't bother to go through the whole story again, but I trained in history, political science, and sociology, but in Latin American studies. But as a consequence of some encounters I had in my doctoral dissertation research, that kind of stuff, I was encouraged and kind of pushed to look at the British Marxist historians as to what they'd have to say about class struggle. And I just became fascinated by them, and all the more sort of intent upon doing something when historians my own age in the late 70s had turned away from historical studies into a kind of structuralist Marxism and actually were attacking the very figures who I became all the more fascinated by and encouraged and influenced by. So I wrote that book in many ways, not as a defense of them, but the fact that no one was really appreciating the depth and degree of their work regarding whether it had to do with the transition from feudalism to capitalism, or for that matter, peasants and feudalism, or the early modern 17th century struggles in England, the making of the English working class, and such things. I wrote that book, and it was successful, and it's really, in a way, it's never been out of print, although it's now with the third publisher
Right.
over the course of nearly 40 years. The publisher is Zero Books, if anyone goes looking.
It's a
It's
great book for the young or old leftist in your life. There's chapters on Rodney Hilton, Christopher Hill, Maurice Dobb, Eric Hobsbawm, and he writes the intro, the forward
the
to your
forward.
book.
The forward. He
Right.
was very kind. He wrote the forward. Right.
And the reason I recommend this book is Marx is heavy lifting. This is a soft entry point into Marx, and if you can't read Capital, and if you're me and you want to pretend you read Capital, pick up the British Marxist historians. It's great for young people who want to familiarize themselves with a way to study history through the prism of class struggle. Is Marxism, we're told it's more popular than ever, but that cannot be true.
I don't think that's quite true. But let's put it this way. Back when I was working on that book, it seemed to me there was a more dynamic intellectual set of exchanges going on about Marxism, how one might read Marx not merely for the, if you like, intellectual and historical value, but also for what he might have to say to today. Now, today there is a dynamic, both especially in this country, say around Jacobin magazine and some other places, and all the shows that have emerged out of that. Our friend Ben Burgess
Right,
with Give Them an Argument,
right.
the Left Reckoning show. Um, it's no longer produced, but the Jacobin show that came out on a weekly basis that unfortunately he's no longer producing, and my friend Cale Brooks. But all of that said, I don't necessarily feel like there's the same kind of, if you like, vibrancy and set of exchanges that used to take place. On the other hand, and this is important, it's clearly the case that today, whether we're talking about young people in the United States or young people anywhere else, that socialism is not as necessarily a forbidden subject as it once was. And in fact, in that way, maybe it's good because there's now maybe a pluralist understanding of socialism, influenced not only by Marx, but by an American radical tradition, these British Marxist historians, those kinds of things. Yeah.
Right.
So, but you did ask what I'm doing right now.
Well, let me ask you a question
Oh,
before
sorry.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's okay. I
I
can
said
wait.
something on the show and I got some pushback that Biden, for better or worse, and you and I would agree worse, he's racked up some legislative achievements that would facilitate his renomination and possibly his reelection, a close reelection. And I said, I'm not making the case for him. I'm just saying the Democratic Party is not run by leftists by any
Right.
stretch. And this is what I got pushback on. I said, and this country, sadly, is not as left as we wish it were. Is that true?
Yeah, that's interesting. That is a damn good question. Okay, which is the kind of thing I've been working on probably now for 30 years. When I started my work on Thomas Paine, it was in part to consider the question you just asked. When I did my work on Franklin Roosevelt and the Greatest Generation, that was definitely a part of my effort to answer the question. Now, here's the thing. In the terms of the politics of the United States today, it is further to the left than it probably has been in quite some time. However, the political establishment of the Democratic Party remains essentially neoliberal. I mean, Bernie Sanders is undeniably a major force, but he's also a contained force inside the Democratic Party.
So are you
Okay,
saying that Americans
but I
are
haven't wait, but hold on.
okay?
But I still claim, as I've claimed for a long time, and I think my historical arguments stand up, that Americans themselves are potentially, and I say potentially because it depends on how they're engaged, further to the left than the politics that prevails in America today. And I say that because let me remind everyone in 2000, let's go back to 2015-16, when Bernie and basically the election in the primaries in the Democratic Party came down to Bernie and Hillary. And over in the Republican Party, Trump basically wiped the floor with the other Republican candidates. There was a survey done in 2000, guess it was mid to late 2015 that asked the question, what kind of change do you wish to see in America? And the term that explained what the majority of Americans clicked as their answer was radical. Now, radical doesn't necessarily, to me, it means left. But to a lot of people, it can mean any number of things. And the most important thing is what it meant is they wanted to see dramatic change. And when you look at the polling that was done on everything from national health care to the cost of higher education and the need to, end student debt, and when you looked at the issues and the answers, that implied that Americans, as I said before, were potentially left. And that when people answered, they wanted to see radical change, many of those folks were by no means even willing to vote for a Democrat. Here's the thing. So when Bernie entered the campaign as the socialist, well, what he called the Democratic Socialist, and Trump is in there, it seemed as if Americans' aspirations were being answered. Because, look, we don't need to go into all of the evils of Trump and Trumpism. But there were things he said that were very appealing to working people who were already for many years suffering Clinton's NAFTA and a whole series of neoliberal policies.
Right.
The idea of closing the border in some fashion it may well seem reactionary, but it addressed people's concerns. And I don't mean their racialist concerns. I mean, it addressed their concerns about the fact that there were all the more jobs that were being offered that were subpar and low pay, okay, and that they didn't want to do. And so all of these folks from south of the border were coming in, and which basically, as far as they were concerned, and by the way, in certain places it probably did happen, was in essence enabling corporations to lower their wages in those places. And since nobody was raising the minimum wage, what are you going to do? So anyhow, so Trump may have seemed to a lot of people. Also, he wanted to basically, in his own way, it was full of shit. But in his own way, sorry, I'm using a four-letter word, which
you already said Trump. You said Trump. You might as well go for it all.
Right.
Might as well say the F word.
Yeah, he was talking about trying to inspire or revive manufacturing and so on. So there were those things that might have appealed, regardless of the bullshit that surrounded it and the racism that surrounded it. Bernie was a decidedly appealing force, especially among young people. And I can tell you, and it's anecdotal, but a lot of my students would say to me, my family, my parents, and these are like 18-year-olds who were just going to vote for the first time, would say, my parents would love to vote for Bernie, but he's now in the final, and in the end, in the general election, he's not on the ballot. So a lot of folks who voted in 2016 for Trump in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania would readily have voted for Bernie, which implies that with the right politics, the right vision, the right anger, perhaps, indeed, there could have been a left at least social democratic politics. So what I'm getting at is we may not seem to be, especially given the fascist threat we've endured, we may not seem to be that terribly much to the left, but the possibilities are there. And the sad part is that the Biden administration, as I've said many times, like many Democrats, probably since the late 60s into the 70s, just generally don't have confidence. They don't trust their fellow citizens to offer them the kind of agenda that working people would want. That's first. Second, in the course of the 70s, I go back to the 70s a lot, is when really the whole question of donations and donors and big business and, the wealthy literally shaping the parties became all the more damaging to the Democratic Party.
Right.
So here we are 45 years later, and the polls show Americans want a progressive agenda and even perhaps a radical agenda given the politics of this moment. But it's the case that they're just not being afforded it by Democrats. I like to call them the Bidenettes right now,
Right.
And by the way, that's not necessarily a feminine term or a female term. That's a diminutive in language. It means the Bidenettes being small-minded and sort of.
So you're not offending women. You're offending little people. So just if you're gonna write a letter complaining,
Well, actually, I think what it is that I'm offending marionettes.
oh, good, okay,
But there, in some ways, maybe that is the metaphor. Marionettes are being,
yes,
they're
yeah.
dancing, to the tune basically that's provided by the guy who owns them.
Kevin McCarthy wants to be speaker. We're not sure he's going to be. He's going to make it. He's got to put a broad coalition together
Yeah, I was
of
listening today to someone remarking about the fact that I think it was Michael Moore. His podcast this week had to do with, have you seen any Republican on television smile? That was his way of putting it.
so be careful what you wish. I mean, he wants to be speaker in the worst way, and he is going to be speaker in the worst way. Is the same true about Bernie had he won in 2020? Because he said, if I win, it's going to be part of a massive revolution. They said, how are you going
Yeah,
to
he
get all
called it
these
a political revolution. Yeah.
that there's going to be this Bernie wave. It's just not going to be me. It's going to be transformative. What would have happened had Bernie won, but he had the Congress and the Senate Biden had to work with? He would have been destroyed. There, without an undergirding of leftists in the House and the Senate, he would have been demolished. Nothing would have
Well, it would
gotten
have been
passed.
interesting to see this. I mean, this is all hypothetical, of course. It would have been interesting to see, had he been the nominee, to what extent the Democratic Party itself would have moved, not just Bernie as and his administration, the Democratic Party itself would have moved to the left. I mean, there are congressmen and women who probably would have been in some ways liberated by Bernie's presidency. Okay, I mean, how often do we hear about the likes of Jamie Raskin, other than when in recent times with the investigations and the hearings?
Right.
I mean, and somebody like him might well have come forward as a really significant figure. Andy Levin, who just lost in
Yes.
Michigan, okay, by no, in some way, actually no fault of his own. They set it up to screw him, I imagine. I mean, Andy Levin, as a very pro-labor congressman coming out of the labor movement himself. I mean, there are those kinds of folks. And maybe then when the likes of the Squad come in, they wouldn't have been, I shouldn't put it this way. I almost want to say tamed or at least corralled.
Right.
Okay. I mean, things Bernie Sanders' election would have reverberated and possibly given the agenda that he was advancing, and it wasn't quite a vision, but at least the agenda he was advancing, that it's not inconceivable that developments over in the Republican Party might have been a bit different, given they would have had to respond to him and not to someone who was perhaps easier to push around because they were already neoliberals, not social democrats. I mean, it's hard to say.
The railway bill, Biden
Yeah.
is forcing on the railway workers. He turned his back on the unions during a lame
Yeah, I mean,
duck
it's really absolutely, absolutely. Because people said to me, "Well, he was just doing what was in the best interest of the American people, because had there been a strike, there would have been, talk about a, shut down, what do they call it, the supply chain backup.
Right.
$2 billion a day it would have cost the economy. I mean, children wouldn't have had their Christmas presents. Santa Claus would have ceased to exist. You know all the
Right.
story." But what people are forgetting, and this is a big problem, people always take up the issue after the fact. I'm calling this new thing now after the real fact. And the real fact is that a few months ago, maybe my count of months is off, a few months ago, he said that he intervened and he was going to take care of this. And what did he do? He walked away from what he thought was a negotiation, having secured, to his mind, a raise and other things, but he never really got to the matter, which is really, by the way, a really important matter for railway workers, given the terrible conditions that they endure working for those railways. So healthcare, may seem like, a week's worth of sick leave, maybe to a lot of people who are used to getting sick leave paid, which is not a universal in this country, may not seem like very much, but to people who are having constantly to be on call, who have to travel, okay, or basically somebody said to me, they're like the U.S. Marines. Are on call 24 hours a day,
Exactly.
these railway workers.
Yeah.
So for him to basically cut a deal that he thought was a victory and leave railway workers without paid sick leave. I don't care how good their salaries are. If you don't get paid sick leave and you're being punished for having taken a sick day, that's in itself kind of morally criminal, I would think. So it's inconceivable to me that a man who's postured as the greatest friend of labor in the White House since FDR, okay, it turns out to be the guy who in the wake of their of their not losing the U.S. Senate and on the verge of the Georgia vote, is now screwing the railway workers, as if he's only screwing the railway workers. Believe me, the labor movement as such is not going to forget this. Okay, they're just not going to forget this. And I know I was talking to a couple of really significant labor activists and one labor leader, and they said, look, whether there's a strike or not is up to the railway workers. Okay, but people are agitated right now. Okay, and the biggest mistake Democrats make is they think everything will be smoothed over. Well, they're not going to. It's not going to. I don't
Right.
think it's going to be so readily smoothed over.
Right.
I mean, a lot of people are going to keep talking about it. It's even this week. It's only a week or two since the event, but people are talking about it. People are tweeting it. It's going to go on and on for quite a while.
They
And
spoke of a strike as though it was a Category 5 hurricane smashing into Christmas. Am I being glib when I say a strike is good for this country? A little, maybe we bite the bullet, and a little pain for the working people is a good thing.
I don't. I never think pain is ever a good thing. That's my take.
But a national
But I,
strike, shutting down the railways and letting the bosses know who's boss, in the long run, that benefits all of us.
Yeah, If it does, if it succeeds, okay. I mean, which it hopefully would have, but I can't guarantee that fact. Don't forget, the first thing I tweeted when this was in the makings was my recollection and my study, to very little extent, but more than most people, of the Patco strike back in early, the first year
But
or so of the Reagan administration.
those were federal workers.
They were federal workers,
And they
Reagan
they didn't
had
have
the
a right
power
to
and authority to
Right.
fire them all, which he did.
Right.
Okay, but this is the other thing. Let's also not forget, to go back to why people won't so readily forget, is that as wrong-headed as it may be to still operate railways in terms of a law that was enacted in 1926, the Railway Act, it's also the case that Biden and the Congress did not have to do what they did. They could have acted 2 to 3 months ago. That's what I mean by everyone saying they waited to the moment of crisis where it looked like he had no choice. He had a choice weeks and weeks ago. Number one, he could have told the railway billionaires, look, if you're not going to do it, and if you're threatening to do a lockout, I'll take over the railways. I'll do it. I'll sign an executive order nationalizing the railways.
What happened when
And
Harry Truman did that with the steel companies?
Well, the fact is that it's not an unusual thing. It's not necessarily what you want to do, but it would have shown that he was on the side of the workers. And all across the country, working people would have applauded. And by the way, whether I would have liked it or not, he would have been on his way to re-election.
Right.
Keeping in mind, if he did that weeks and weeks ago. Plus, all these congressional figures from, like Pelosi and then the new guy who's taking her place, Jeffries, they all, talked about, how tragic it was that they were going to have to do what they were about to do. But they could have acted weeks ago. These Democrats obviously were answering to the tune of the billionaires. And by the way, even if they weren't immediately doing so, the fact is that then they're guilty even more so, to the extent that they literally ignored the needs of working people for so long, right?
Yep. Yep. The Railway Act, it gives the president the power through Congress, through a bill,
Yeah,
to
right.
force the railway workers back to work. Does it force management to accept a contract?
No, what it is that this is the way to look at it. Because I don't know the details of the Railway
Right.
Act, but I want to give you a comparison. During the Obama presidency, Obama signed an executive order, which, by the way, I talked about doing this kind of thing on your show many a time. He signed an executive order. I think it said that federal, every company that received federal contracts had to afford its workforce 7 days of paid sick leave. That was an executive order by Obama of all people.
Right.
Okay, it excluded the railway workers at that time. What am I going to say? I mean, that I don't know exactly why. But it is the case that Biden might well have tried to issue an executive order that lifted that exclusion. I mean, that's the point. That they've now, they waited. It's as if they wanted to show, I don't know who they wanted to show. They wanted to show people that they could do exactly what the billionaires wanted them to, right?
They saved them $320 million. It would have cost $320 million a
Right.
year to give them 5 to 7 days of sick.
Yeah, I read David Sirota, I think, on his Lever News
Right.
made some estimation that in 3 days of profits they could have paid for the
Yeah.
whole
it's
thing.
it's just unbridled greed.
Well, that literally, that's what drives me crazy these days. Because to segue, if you don't mind, so I'm working on this piece about Franklin Roosevelt, and unfortunately, for too many years, and it's not that he doesn't deserve criticism. Franklin Roosevelt was no saint, and we could go through all the reasons he wasn't. But I'm writing this piece on Franklin Roosevelt that I've been asked to provide to a brand new volume on the history of American political thought that Princeton is bringing out. So I'm doing this chapter. And as I go back, every time I go back over FDR's speeches, what's striking, for all of his faults and failings, is just how determined he was to literally overthrow what remained of the Gilded Age political and economic power structure. How many people realize that when FDR was president, he not only sought to tax corporations and the rich in an unprecedented way, one, he was so eager to reduce the maldistribution of income and wealth that he actually proposed to Congress that they cap, listen to this, cap the amount of money you could accumulate. Okay, I mean, that's pretty, to me, I mean, when have you ever
And,
heard that?
and then tax
right?
it. They would tax it.
Yeah,
Right.
literally, and anything above it, they couldn't keep, basically. And then most people might know that during the war, he then also proposed the same. But he first did that 2 years into his presidency, because he really was concerned about the maldistribution of wealth and income in the United States. He said in 1930, in the midst of the Great Depression, when he was governor of New York, he wrote to a really good friend, John Kingsbury, who was the foremost scholar on questions of social welfare in the United States. And he wrote to him and he said, as far as I can see, this country needs to go fairly radical for at least a generation. And that's exactly what he did. I'm not absolving him of whatever sins he committed. Okay? But it is the case. He was, by any standard, a radical president who accomplished radical things. Why? Not because he wanted to originally do all of those things, but once he proposed in public these things, working people rallied behind him and pushed him to go even further than he had originally proposed. So as I do that, as you know, it's always the case whenever I'm working on this FDR stuff, whether it was during the Obama years or now, with Biden, I keep thinking to myself, God, this isn't. If FDR came back again, he might be terribly pleased by certain changes that he himself had, could not enact because of the Southern Democrats, but he'd be shocked at the degree to which the Democratic Party has turned its back on the working class and left the working class without for 45 years.
It's partly the fault of the consultants because we could have landslide after landslide. As you just said, if Biden spoke up for the railway workers, we'd have Roosevelt era landslides. The consultants don't want landslides. They want to
Well, that's true.
justify.
They wouldn't be able to make their money if
They
people
can't
didn't
make
need
their
to
money.
ask them what to do.
They make it harder for Democrats to win to justify their salaries. And I'm not,
Yeah.
I mean that.
I know you do, and I think there's some truth in that. And by the way, it's interesting as I've spoken to some what would you call them, campaign managers who have no sympathy for the consultants because they cost a lot of money. They take money away from the kinds of things that campaign managers would like to do at the grassroots level. And generally these consultants also tell the candidates not to sound too progressive.
Right.
Don't sound too progressive, you know?
Because these consultants want to get hired in the next cycle for a centrist or possibly a Republican. Harvey J.K., Professor Harvey J.K., author of The British Marxist Historians. Go buy this book for the leftist in your life. This is a great stocking stuffer. It's Christmas. It's the time to buy gifts. And this is published by Zero Books. How do people buy this?
Well, they can go online to the usual suspects. They can also go online to Zero Books, okay, at Zero Books, and order it through Zero Books themselves, or a very preferred way for people on the left, Red Emma's Bookshop in Baltimore, okay, is very happy to fulfill orders of the book. If you're in New York City, there are some really good shops that I might recommend to contact, like McNally Jackson down in Soho, also over in Brooklyn. I can't tell you it's in every good bookshop, but I know that you can pick it up online or in those kinds of stores.
Follow Professor
And by the way,
Harvey.
David, I want to say again, it's great to see you.
It's great.
You've been missed for 2 months. Oh, I should also add, you don't have to celebrate Christmas to buy my book. You can celebrate Hanukkah. You can celebrate Kwanzaa. You can celebrate the winter. Is it called the solstice?
Yeah.
Whatever drives you.
Yes.
You bet.
And take hold of our history, FDR.
Oh, yeah. Should I show pictures of
Show
those?
some, very quickly. FDR and democracy, take hold of our
Okay,
history.
FDR and democracy. Will people
There
see
you
this?
go.
Or
Yeah.
FDR and democracy, or
The Fight for
Fight
the
for the
Four
Four Freedoms, which is a more progressive book than the military medal might look. That's not a medal. That's not a medal encouraging war. That's a medal celebrating the fact that the war was over. It's
Right.
the Four Freedoms Medal.
Right.
Okay. So, I mean, lots of things to get. And then take hold of our history. Here we go. Take hold of our history. My speeches and essays of, from the past 10 years and more, basically haranguing Democrats, bewailing the state of American politics, and wishing the Democrats were more like what you and I were talking about.
Exactly. Follow Professor Harvey J.K. on Twitter at Harvey J.K. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, David.